Coming up, the Nets' historic rookie class makes its NBA debut. I'll break down the highs and the lows of tonight's action after this.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And on today's show, I'm going to be reacting to the Nets' first Summer League game, and of course, the rookie debuts of Egor Demin, Nolan Traore, Ben Saraf, and Danny Wolf. I'm out here in Las Vegas. If you are watching on YouTube, hopefully you can tell I tried to get the strip there in the background in the window of my hotel room, but got here earlier today, just watched the Nets play the Oklahoma City Thunder. They fell 90-81 in a game over at Thomas and Mack Center. And obviously it was the long-awaited debut of this Nets rookie class, and we really saw a lot of traits and interesting characteristics from each of those players. So I'm going to break down all of it, but I wanted to start with Nolan Traore and his performance because I do think that Traore was the bright spot of this Nets team in this game. He was the main ball handler of this group, and he's an interesting player. You know, I talked about Traore at length on a recent podcast with Derek Parker, draft analyst from YouTube, and we outlined why we felt that he was the team's most encouraging draft pick outside of Egor Demin, you know, of the late round picks. And he's a guy that got at number 19. He had some really high pedigree at this time last year. A lot of people thought that he was going to be a top 5 pick in what was regarded as a really, stacked top of the draft there. He had some struggles and he fell, but there's a lot of characteristics that we thought could make him a steal for the Nets, for a steal pick for the Nets at 19. And I think that those were on full display tonight. And you just talk about his ball handling ability, his speed, his ability to collapse the defense, his ability to be, kind of a walking paint touch. He showed all of that today. And Jordi Fernandez and the Nets coaching staff, I feel like, have been extremely high on how dynamic Traore can be as a ball handler. Jordi was talking about it at the introductory press conference for the rookies, and he said that the Nets want to play with pace in the full court and the half court, and he feels like they got the fastest player in the draft. And he was referring to Traore there, and that wasn't, just him blowing smoke up him. It was a common thought and a common descriptor of Traore going into the draft and after. A lot of people thought that he was the fastest north-south player in the draft. And that speed, that burst and explosiveness was really on full display today while he was serving as the team's main ball handler. He was a guy who, in transition and in the half court, really got into the paint almost whenever he wanted. He was able to get downhill. There were some nice finishes. He was able to get downhill and spray to some shooters. He was able to find some big men ducking in. So being able to touch the paint is arguably the most important skill of a lead ball handler, and Traore was able to do that tonight. He finished with 13 points, 3 assists, 3 of 5 field goals, 1 of 3 from 3, and 6 of 6 from the free throw line. So he really was pressing the issue, and he's a guy that looked really comfortable. And we've obviously, it's an interesting dynamic because once the Nets took Egor Demin at number 8 overall, he's the guy who was a point guard at BYU. He was a lead ball handler, and that obviously raised the questions of why did the Nets take Nolan Traore at 19 and Ben Saraf at 26? Because those guys are also both lead ball handlers. But in this game, Traore was the main guy, and him and Demin, were playing together, but Demin was more off the ball, and Traore was, handling the ball as the lead guy. So that could be a little bit more of what the dynamic is relative to what Nets fans were expecting. And I'm going to touch on that in a later segment with Demin, but there are some reasons why that could make sense. And one of them is, Demin is obviously regarded as the highest level passer among most draft analysts in this year's class. But the knock on him obviously was that he struggled creating separation. He struggled getting downhill. He doesn't have as much shake or speed with the ball in his hand. So outside of being a pick and roll ball handler, it was really difficult for him to create advantages. With Traore, he doesn't maybe have the same level of playmaking, but he's still a very good passer, and he can create advantages, unlike Demin. And I think you saw that tonight if you watch this game. Traore is a guy with the ball in his hands. He can turn the corner, I think, as good as anybody in the draft. He did that consistently tonight to get downhill. He can blow past people in transition, and he has a little bit of shake with the ball in his hands. Like we saw a few really nice jab fakes, a few really nice crossovers. He's a guy who has a little bit of wiggle to complement that speed and explosiveness with his first step. And if you get that and you get him touching the paint consistently, and he can, be a consistent finisher, if he can have some mid-range scoring potential, which you've seen in the past, and if that jump shot, which is a question for all the Nets ball handlers, can come around, there is some three-level scoring and playmaking potential there in the half court to complement what he should be a pretty dynamic transition ball handler alongside a guy like Demin and some of the other picks that the Nets made. So Traore, I think, was a really encouraging performance in this game. I think he's a guy that if I were Nets fans, I would be really excited about the fact that they got him at 19 because of just some of the natural fluidity that he has as a ball handler, some of the athletic traits that he brings to the table. And I think that if you look at what the potential and the flashes, the tools that he has as a scorer and the court vision and playmaking, I think when you blend all of that together into one package, that's a lead ball handler or a point guard that you're probably not going to get at 19 in a lot of drafts. So I would definitely feel good. And I think that this was an encouraging first performance for Nolan Traore. And I think it was really interesting how the Nets used him alongside Egor Demin. And that was obviously a huge conversation going into Summer League. How are those two going to coexist alongside one another? In this game, Traore was the main ball handler. Demin was a little bit more off the ball. And I'm going to touch on what we saw from Demin and some comments that we had from him about his position and the Nets coaching staff about how he performed. So get to all that after a quick break. But before that, I want to tell you about our friends over at Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends and family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last-minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. And they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Guys, Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for an upcoming MLB game, whether you want to see the Yankees play or the Mets in New York City. Wherever you want to go, Game Time has you covered. Game Time also has last-minute tickets and zone deals for big savings, like 10% off exclusive zone deals for the FIFA World Cup matchups. Guys, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app. Last-minute deals, lowest price, guaranteed. Coming back from the break on today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Brooklyn's Summer League debut and the rookie debut of Egor Demin, his first NBA action with the Nets. Demin, it was an interesting game for him. He played off the ball for most of this game, and that was really intriguing, I think, to a lot of fans for a guy that obviously was a lead ball handler and a point guard at BYU, and then comes in and in his first game as a member of the Nets, really doesn't have the ball in his hands for a lot of the game. Demin finished with 6 points, 4 rebounds, 0 assists, which I think is pretty interesting to a lot of people. And he was 2 of 5 from the field, and all of those were 3-point attempts. So he was 2 of 5 from 3. So good to start with the positives. And I think the positives of, what Demin was able to show while being a little bit more of an off-ball player in this game, I think the shooting stroke was definitely a positive. He was a guy who looked confident. He knocked down a couple of really deep looks. And when you're talking about Demin, we obviously said leading up to the draft and after the pick that shooting was going to be the swing skill for him if he's going to be a successful NBA player. Because what he does as a ball handler, as a pick and roll guy, as a guy who doesn't necessarily, isn't able to create advantages by himself off the dribble all the time. You need to be able to shoot off the dribble to make defenses respect you. And then also him shooting well was going to allow him to play other positions, whether it be a wing or forward, anything that you want to do with him. He needs to be able to shoot the ball respectively and space the floor alongside other ball handlers if you want him to have that positional versatility, which adds, a lot to his upside. And a lot of people, I think, have had questions about whether Demin was going to be able to be a decent shooter at the NBA level. He didn't shoot well. I think he was around, 28% at BYU. But the Nets have been adamant, man, throughout this pre-draft process. It sounds like they really wowed, he really wowed them with what he did from a shooting perspective. And it gave them the conviction to say at several turns, whether it's Jordi Fernandez, whether it's Sean Marks, whether it's Summer League head coach Steve Hetzel, have all said that he is a high-level shooter, and he's going to continue to be a high-level shooter. So they clearly feel that way, and I think that this game was an encouraging sign from that respect because he was not at all hesitant to pull the trigger, and he hit on a couple of really deep pulls off the catch, which is something where if he's going to play off the ball, you're going to want to see that. And him playing off the ball for most of this game, I think, was pretty interesting. I think it shouldn't be shocking. I think the degree to which, how much he did play off the ball for this game, I think is a little surprising. But the fact that the Nets had him playing the wing alongside Traore, I don't think should come as a complete surprise because we knew that those two were going to, the Nets were going to want those two obviously to share the ball, to share the floor together. And for them to do that, Demin was probably going to be the guy that was going to have to play off the ball. In this game, it was most of the game that he did not have the ball in his hands. And I talked with a draft analyst, several people, Derek Parker, a guy I've mentioned before, I think is a really talented analyst. I really respect what he had to say. When I asked him what position he viewed Demin at long term, he said he viewed him as a small forward, as a wing, as kind of a connective playmaker who could be that guy off the ball, who will have the ball in his hands sometimes, but also can play off the ball and, be a connector from those guards to the big men. So I think that I thought that was interesting, coming out of that episode with Derek. And that was the case, at least in this game, with, Egor playing off the ball alongside Nolan Traore for a lot of the game. And I asked Egor after the game, since he has been just considered a point guard by a lot of people throughout the pre-draft process, and even himself by account with some comments, I asked him, just the prospect of playing these other positions and adding that versatility excite him, because he's someone who said, since he got picked by the Nets, that he's going to do whatever the coaches, want him to do. And he seems like he's been very bought in and eager to that. And when I asked him if that prospect of playing other positions excited him, he said, I'm going to read you the whole quote because I thought it was a really good quote from him. He said, 100%, I got a little too deep into this point guard thing, calling myself that. Now I prefer to say I'm a playmaker. I just really want to learn how to make plays off the ball, how to be a cutter, how to be a screener, how to rebound the ball, and really improving myself on defense. Being a point guard nowadays is not coming to the idea of just bringing the ball up and organizing everybody. It is that for sure, but there's playmakers on the court who are not point guards, and that's where I see myself at. I really want to be all over the court. So that was a pretty, interesting take, I think, from Egor, a guy saying, who has been considered a point guard by a lot of people, and, by what he just said himself, saying that I think, it's a pretty good indication that he's going to spend a fair amount of time off the ball and how the Nets are viewing him potentially long-term in their system. And I think a lot of that probably ties into the transition game as well, because I know that throughout the pre-draft process in Jordy's meetings with Egor, he was really emphasizing him being a grab-and-go guy in transition, because when you're talking about having multiple ball handlers on the floor, which is something that the Nets clearly put a priority on with Egor, with Nolan Traore, with Ben Saraf, whoever gets the ball, out of those groups of guys can push and they can start the break without having to find that one guy for the outlet pass. So Egor has the potential to be that transition, guy who spurs the fast break. I think we saw some of that today with him pushing the ball and also just hitting some really good get-ahead passes. So I think that there's potential for that. And then in the half court, he's still a guy that obviously going to handle in the pick and roll, but if he's able to play off the ball and have that positional versatility, and he is able to shoot the ball respectably, as we saw him do today, I think that adds a really intriguing element to his game. And I think that would answer a lot of the questions from the Nets draft about, why would they pick Traore alongside Demin and Saraf and all these guys? And is there going to be enough? There's only one ball. Is there going to be enough touches to go around? I think that Demin being able to play off the ball and him fitting into that position, I think would go a long way. Now, it also does raise some other questions, because when you look at Egor and what he did well at BYU, it was really just heavy pick and roll ball handling. And that really allowed his playmaking gifts to shine. And his main skill, his elite skill, is obviously his passing. A lot of people consider him the best passer in the draft. And a lot of that at BYU was coming out of the pick and roll. And when you look at it in this game, he was playing off the ball and he really did not run a lot of pick and roll at all, like barely any. And because of that, he really didn't touch the paint at all, which is obviously a concern. And that is, what the knock on Demin was coming into the draft, as I said earlier, that when he's a guy who has the ball in his hands by himself, he's not really a guy who's creating advantages off the dribble. He doesn't have much shake. He doesn't have a ton of, lateral agility. He's not a guy who's blowing by people all the time unless he's presented a lane. So with the Nets not running pick and roll for Egor much today and him being off the ball, when he did get his touches, he really wasn't able to get into the paint, and that was reflected in his 5 field goal attempts, all being 3-pointers. So it brings in an interesting question of if Egor's a guy who's going to be playing off the ball and his best skill up to this point had been pick and roll ball handling, is he going to be maximized in that role? And I think that there's a number of ways that the Nets can look to, maximize his skill set, even if he is playing somewhat more of an off-ball role. And I think that a huge part of that is going to be the transition game. We heard Jody Fernandez talk about it. I know that was a big part of what attracted them to Egor. I know it's a big part of what they talked about, what Jordy talked about with him in his meetings during the pre-draft process was his ability to be a grab-and-go guy. Because at that point, you look at, a big thing the Nets talked about today and they have in the past is having multiple ball handlers and what kind of advantage that presents. And when you have guys like Egor or Nolan Traore or Ben Saraf potentially on the floor at the same time, at that point, whoever gets the ball can be that grab-and-go guy in transition without you having to look for that outlet guy and find the point guard and waste time that way. It just springs the fast break that much quicker. And for Egor, he's a guy who I think the Nets are really excited about his ability to push the pace and dribble and get out and use that playmaking ability. And I think we saw some of that today. We also just saw his ability to be a guy who makes the quick hit-ahead pass. That was something that Steve Hetzel, the Nets Summer League coach, really praised Egor for. And he said it's something that goes unnoticed, is the ability to get the rebound, look up court, and make the quick hit-ahead pass that springs the break and gives you that split-second advantage before the defense even has a second to get ready. I think it's something that we obviously saw Ben Simmons do and was really good at for the Nets for a little bit. So I think that transition game is going to be a big part. And in the half court for Egor, even if he is playing the wing, you can still run high pick and roll as a wing player. We see plenty of wing guys that run pick and roll, and you can have that guy like Nolan Traore or Ben Saraf or whatever guy might be running the point alongside Egor play off the ball for those possessions. You can also run other off-ball actions, whether just, some pin downs, some zoom actions to get Egor coming around and create an advantage for him that way and get him going downhill to a point where he can make some plays that way. We didn't see a ton of that tonight, but I would expect that, I would expect to see more of that. And I would just expect to see more balance than we saw tonight in terms of, him being a guy who has the ball a little bit more than he did and a guy who they're running some more stuff for and a guy who's looking to try to get downhill and create more advantages. And he might need those advantages created for him at this stage, as I said, whether through pick and roll or zoom actions or whatever you want to say. But I also don't want to discount the fact that he could be a guy who works on that handle, gets a little bit better, creating advantages on his own, adds some strength to his frame. I think that would be really big to create advantages and be able to bump defenders off their spots. That was something that Steve Hetzel talked about after the game, as when he was talking about Egor's development track. He said his passing is his best skill. He talked about transition, all that stuff. And he said adding muscle is going to be a big part of Egor's development. So I think all of that is, going to be really interesting for Egor. I think, last thing I want to touch on also is his defense. He's a guy who, I think defensively, I got to watch him up close. I've seen him. This is my second time I saw him in person. I also watched him in the Sweet 16 at Prudential Center when BYU played Alabama. But this game, I was really up like courtside and watching him and getting to see him up close. And I think that he played pretty well defensively. And I think that was something that Sean Marks talked about after they drafted him, was the length. They liked what, he brought from that perspective. They liked what they saw on tape with him being able to use his length to guard some pick and rolls, being able to dig down on driving and passing lanes and shrink those. And also, he's a guy who, while he's not the best side-to-side athlete, like, he's not a stiff either. He can still move side to side. So when you're a guy who's 6'8" barefoot, probably plays at 6'9", has a 6'10" wingspan, can move and isn't a total stiff from that regard, I think that could lend itself to some encouraging defensive versatility. And we saw it today, like second possession of the game, Egor was on the wing defensively and a guy tried to drive. He dug down, got a steal there. The Nets missed a shot. OKC came back in transition and he took a charge. So that is just something, we saw a lot of defensive plays throughout the night. I think that he was really locked in. And I think that he's a guy, many people didn't think that he was going to be a plus defender in the NBA, and he might not be a plus defender, we'll see, but I think that he's a guy who has enough tools with the size, the length, the mobility that he does have, and a guy who's just going to be engaged and locked in from that perspective defensively and give full effort. I really have zero doubts about that. We know Andre Karolinko's in his corner and all that, one of the best, better NBA defenders that we've seen in this century. So I just think that defensively, he has some more going for him than maybe people wanted to admit throughout the pre-draft process. And you have that with, him potentially playing more of an off-ball role, or him being that wing guy, not off-ball, but just being a wing. You have maybe the shooting coming around if he can, continue, and if he shoots to the level the Nets say that they think he will, and you have those defensive capabilities coupled with some of the playmaking that can be in transition and the pick and roll and zoom, all the things I just talked about. That's an intriguing piece, and that's a piece that is more versatile than just a lead ball handler and a point guard that you need to spam pick and rolls for. So I think that might be part of the upside, and I think people who are confused about the Nets pick at 8, who probably still are, I think that upside and that positional versatility would help to tell yourself the story of why the Nets thought that he could have this potential with the number 8 selection. So it was an interesting debut for Egor. I think it didn't go the way that most people expected, obviously. And I think that we're going to see a little bit of a difference. It's the first game. All these pieces are trying to fit together, but I would expect to see more actions with Egor handling the ball and with him trying to get in the paint and them trying to use his pick and roll playmaking in the half court a little bit more. But I do think that while it wasn't the best debut by any means, I think that the shooting, the defense that we saw, them playing him off the ball and them talking about those possibilities and him talking about the possibilities of buying into that, I think that it's pretty intriguing. I think that, we're going to see a lot more moving forward from Egor, and I'm excited to see how it plays out. But there's still 2 other first-round picks in Ben Saraf and Danny Wolf that we need to touch on. So going to have a quick break, and then I'll close out the show talking about what I saw from both of those guys. Closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Brooklyn's Summer League debut and focusing on their 4 rookie first-round picks. I touched on Nolan Traore and Egor Demin at the top of the show, and I want to close it out talking about the last 2, Ben Saraf and Danny Wolf, 2 guys who, were playing a little bit more complementary roles, but both got really heavy minutes. Wolf started alongside Demin and Traore, and Saraf played pretty heavy minutes too. I don't think either of them played particularly great, but I do think that there were some encouraging aspects of what they were able to do, particularly from Saraf, a guy who was kind of handling the ball as a second, unit ball handler. He played a lot when Demin and Traore were out of the game, so he was kind of manning the point with that second unit. And he didn't, play well from an efficiency standpoint. He finished with 3 points, 2 assists. He was 1 of 5 from the field, 0 of 1 from 3. But I did think we saw some of the ability of what he can do as a ball handler in terms of being an advantage creator. And I think that was the intrigue surrounding Saraf entering this draft for the Nets. Was you look at his measurables, he's a guy who's 6'6" barefoot, probably plays at 6'7", has a plus wingspan, and he's a guy that from an offensive perspective can dribble and, create some advantages and has a little bit of shake and a little bit of, finesse to his game in that way, in the way that Egor Demin particularly didn't have. So it's kind of, a mesh a little bit between what we see with Traore, where, Saraf doesn't have that speed. And I don't think he's, the level of passer that, Demin or Traore is, but he can create those advantages. He does have that size, and he does have enough playmaking ability where I do think that he can make most of the passes that you're going to see in the NBA. So I thought it was interesting from that perspective. I think the 3-point shot, we didn't see him make a 3 in this game. He only took 1. I think he looked tired throughout a lot of the game where, he played 50, 60, whatever games for Ratio Farm in Germany this season. So who knows how he's feeling from that perspective. But I did think that you saw some things about, Saraf being able to get down in the paint, not in the same way that Traore did, but at a similar frequency where he was able to drive. He has a good crossover. He loves this move where he's a lefty. So he loves this move where he crosses right. He has a little bit of shake. He gets the defender moving that way, and then he spins back to his left. He had a really nice bucket in the beginning of the game on that, and he went to it several times after that. So those moves, just the hesitations, the crossovers, the lateral agility, the spin move, he has some tools in his tool bag there. And he also is, by all accounts of what he did in Germany, a pretty high-level passer. So when you have that, he's another guy where if the three-point shot can come around, that would be big. And he also, like Demin, I thought played pretty well defensively in this game. He has good size. He's another guy. I'm watching the game up close, and he's bigger than I thought. Like, he's 6'6" barefoot, has long arms. He's not small in terms of his frame. He's not a very skinny guy, I would say, at this point. He has some muscle on him. So he's a guy where I think there is also some intriguing positional versatility with him. It's going to hinge on the three-point shot, because if he's going to want to play, on or off the ball, he will be able to, I think, to do some things, even if he doesn't turn into a high-level shooter. But if you want him to play off the ball, I think he needs to get that three-point shot to come around. But, while he struggled from the efficiency standpoint, I thought in terms of advantage creation and being able to get downhill and get into the paint, that was encouraging. And I like some of what I saw defensively from Saraf. So that's all I have on him. Last guy closing out the episode is Danny Wolf, who, it was somewhat of a struggle for Wolf in this game. He was 4 points, 6 rebounds, 2 assists, 0 of 5 from the field, and 0 of 3 from 3. So he did not make a field goal. He struggled with some turnovers. I think he had like 4. And we spoke to Wolf after the game, and he said that, I felt like I got sped up. I felt like I was trying to do a little bit too much out there. And it did look like that way. He was doing some things handling the ball where I think he was trying to do a little bit too much with some behind the back moves and things along those lines. But he was a guy who played most of the game at power forward. He really didn't play center in this game. He played alongside Drew Timme for a lot of the game. And, that's something that I should have mentioned when I was talking about Egor Demin and his inability to get into the paint. The Nets didn't run a ton of pick and roll or anything, for him in this game, but he also played a large portion of the game with, Tosan Awoman, Drew Timme, and Danny Wolf on the floor with him. 3 guys who I wouldn't call high-level floor spacers by any stretch of the imagination, or even floor spacers at all up to this point. I think Danny Wolf, the Nets are hopeful that he can reach that point, but I don't think that helped Demin. But getting back to Wolf, he was playing power forward alongside Timme. He was trying to do some things. There were some flashes, like he had one play where he had a nice block. He came back in transition. He ran a pick and roll. He got the ball in the short roll, and he made a really nice wraparound pass while he was going baseline back to Drew Timme in the middle for a layup. He did that. We saw some of him trying to handle the ball in transition. We saw him take, a couple threes and miss them, but I don't think there was a ton to get too excited about with Wolf, but I think you saw some of the fluid athleticism and mobility, and I think that he's a guy who it might take a little bit of time for him to figure out how he's fitting into this puzzle, because the Nets have a lot of ball handlers out there. They have guys, obviously, like Demin, Traore, like Saraf. You have other guys outside of the rookies who are handling the ball for the team this year. He's playing alongside, a big man in Timme, who I think brings some similar things to the table as he does, while he's not a ball handler, like some similar post scoring and things along those lines. So it wasn't the best game from Wolf, but I think that, it's the first game of Summer League for him. I think that it's going to take a while. He's a very unique player in terms of his skill set, a very polarized player. Some people had him going towards the end of the lottery, and then some people had him falling to as far as he did with the Nets. So he's a polarizing player, very unique skill set. I think it's going to take a while to figure out how he fits into this equation, just from himself. And then also the Nets are obviously going to figure out how to utilize him and fit all these pieces together. But when you have a player with as unique a skill set as his, and you have, 3-4 days of practice going into Summer League, and you're playing with all these new pieces, there's going to be some growing pains. And there was that for the guards. And I definitely think there was that for Danny Wolf. And he said that he felt he got sped up. He needed to, play the game a little bit differently and slow it down. And he said that he's going to watch the film and he's going to regroup. And the Nets are going to be back in action on Sunday. So we'll see if Wolf can bounce back. We'll see if Demin is playing a little bit more on the ball, if they do some more things for him there. We'll see if, Traore can build upon that success. We'll see if Saraf can improve from the efficiency and maybe take some 3-point attempts in the next game. There's just going to be a lot of storylines. I'm going to be out here in Vegas for the next week. I'll have coverage of all the Nets games, but that does it for tonight's episode of Locked On Nets. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. If you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy the content, smash that like button, leave a comment. Let me know what you thought about these guys' Summer League debuts and, what you're encouraged by, what you thought was a little bit worrisome, we hope to see moving forward. But I'll have more coverage of all of that when I'm back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.